The sun was low over the dry horizon, painting the Wild West sky in orange and gold. The town of Red Rock seemed quiet on the surface, but behind its wooden walls and dusty streets lived stories of pain, survival, and hidden strength. Among those stories was the life of a woman named Nayeli. She was young, yet her eyes looked older than the desert itself. Life had not been kind to her. Once she had lived free among her Apache people, running through open plains, listening to the sound of drums and watching fires burn beneath the stars. Now those memories were like distant dreams. Her days were filled with endless work at the ranch of a powerful land baron who treated her as less than human. Every morning, before the rooster crowed, she was already awake. She swept the floors, carried heavy buckets of water, and prepared meals she never had the chance to enjoy. Her hands were rough from scrubbing and her back ached from endless chores. The baron gave her no kindness, only orders and sharp words. His men were no better. They spoke as if she were invisible, a tool rather than a person. She was made to stand in the background when important guests came, never allowed to sit, never allowed to speak unless spoken to. But inside her heart, Nayeli carried something they could not touch. It was her pride, her memory of who she had been before chains of circumstance bound her to this life. She remembered her father's voice telling her stories by the fire, her mother teaching her songs that danced with the wind. Those memories gave her the strength to endure. Though her body was trapped, her spirit refused to break. One particular evening, when the baron was entertaining wealthy visitors in his grand dining room, Nayeli was ordered to stand silently by the wall. The room filled with laughter, glasses clinking, and the smell of roasted meat. As the guests bragged about cattle and money, Nayeli's eyes drifted to the window. She longed for the night sky, for freedom beyond these wooden walls. And that was when she noticed him. Outside, near the corral, stood a man she had never seen before. He was tall with a weathered face shaped by sun and wind. His hat sat low on his brow, his boots were dusty from travel, and his eyes, sharp as a hawk's, moved across the yard, as if he had seen too much of the world already. This was Ethan Walker, a cowboy known to some as a drifter, but in truth he was searching for a place where he might finally belong. Ethan had come to Red Rock looking for work. He had fought in battles, herded cattle across rivers, and seen the harshest parts of frontier life. Yet something in this town caught his attention immediately. Not the baron's wealth or power, but the look of the young woman by the window. He could see her even from outside, her posture straight despite the weight of hardship, her dark eyes filled with both sadness and fire. Ethan was the kind of man who noticed details others ignored, and what he saw in Nayeli's eyes told him there was a story worth understanding. The next day, Ethan asked around about work. Some men told him to try the saloon. Others told him the baron sometimes hired hands for cattle drives. By chance, Ethan found himself near the baron's ranch again. He watched as Nayeli carried heavy buckets across the yard, her frame small but determined. The men around her laughed as if she were an object of mockery, but Ethan saw only strength. Later, in the town saloon, Ethan overheard whispers. The baron had taken an Apache woman years ago during a raid. She had never been free since. Folks spoke about it as if it were normal, shrugging it off, but Ethan's jaw tightened with quiet anger. To him, no person deserved such a fate. He knew cruelty when he saw it, and he had long ago promised himself he would never stand idle when injustice was before his eyes. That evening, fate brought Ethan closer to Nayeli. The baron ordered her to fetch supplies from town. With a basket in her arms, she walked carefully along the dusty road. Ethan, leaning against a post, tipped his hat as she passed. She looked at him only for a brief second, her eyes filled with both caution and curiosity. No words were exchanged, but something unspoken moved between them. Recognition, perhaps, that two lives marked by hardship had crossed paths. As she entered the general store, Ethan followed at a distance, not wanting to frighten her. Inside, the shopkeeper barked at her impatiently, acting as if her presence was an inconvenience. She lowered her head, placed her basket on the counter, and waited silently. Ethan stepped forward then, offering to help carry the heavy load. The shopkeeper smirked, but Ethan ignored him. He lifted the basket with ease, nodding toward Nayeli. For the first time in a long time, she felt someone see her not as a servant, but as a woman. On the way back to the ranch, Ethan walked beside her for a short distance. He did not pry or ask questions. He simply said, No one should carry all that alone. It was a simple kindness, but for Nayeli it felt like water in the desert. She gave him a small nod, her lips barely moving as she whispered a quiet, "Thank you." It was the first word she had spoken freely to anyone in years. From that moment, Ethan could not put her out of his mind. He had seen hardship before, seen cruelty in many forms, but something about Nayeli's quiet strength stirred something deeper in him. He knew the Baron would not let her go easily, and he knew standing against such a man could be dangerous. Yet as he watched her walk back into the shadows of that grand ranch house, Ethan felt a choice forming in his heart. He had wandered the West for years with no purpose. Now, perhaps, purpose had found him. For Nayeli, the brief encounter lingered in her thoughts through the night. She lay awake on her small cot, staring at the wooden beams above her. She remembered the way the cowboy's eyes had not looked at her with pity or mockery, but with respect. It had been so long since anyone had done that. She whispered to herself the songs of her people, songs of freedom and resilience, and for the first time in years, she believed that maybe, just maybe, her story was not yet finished. The winds of Red Rock carried change that night, though few could see it yet. The town still slept under the Baron's shadow. The saloon still echoed with laughter, and the ranch still held Nayeli within its grip. But 2 lives had crossed, and with that crossing a spark had been lit. Ethan Walker, the wandering cowboy, and Nayeli, the captive woman with unbroken spirit, were now tied by something unseen. And in the Wild West, where justice was often written in dust and blood, such sparks had the power to burn brighter than the desert sun. The days in Red Rock passed slowly, but for Ethan Walker they began to feel heavier with each sunrise. Ever since he had seen Nayeli, the Apache woman bound to the Baron's ranch, something restless stirred inside him. He had wandered across the West for years, taking odd jobs, drifting from one town to another, never staying long enough to plant roots. But now, every time he walked the streets or sat in the saloon, he found his thoughts drifting back to her face, the quiet strength in her eyes, the way she carried burdens without complaint, and the haunting sadness that lingered in her silence. All of it weighed on him more than he cared to admit. Ethan wasn't a man who sought trouble, but trouble often found him. He had the kind of presence that unsettled men who thrived on power and fear. His calm nature and steady stare challenged the arrogance of bullies, and in Red Rock there was no bigger bully than the land baron, Charles Denton. Denton owned more cattle than most men could count, more land than the town map could cover, and more influence than the sheriff himself. Folks whispered his name in lowered voices, careful never to speak too boldly. It was no secret that Denton's wealth came not only from cattle, but from cruelty. He controlled men with money and fear, and he controlled Nayeli with chains of circumstance. Some townsfolk pitied her, but most turned away, telling themselves it was not their business. Ethan, however, found it impossible to look away. One hot afternoon, the truth struck him like a branding iron. Ethan had gone to the saloon for a drink, sitting at the bar while dusty cowhands laughed over cards. The swinging doors opened, and in walked Denton himself with 2 of his men. Behind them, carrying a basket of supplies, was Nayeli. She was told to stand by the door while Denton ordered whiskey, and began boasting loudly about a new cattle deal. The saloon filled with Denton's laughter, but Ethan's eyes remained fixed on Nayeli. A drunken cowboy staggered near her, spilling his drink. Instead of apologizing, he barked a harsh word at her, blaming her for his own clumsiness. Denton and his men laughed as if mocking her was sport. Ethan felt the muscles in his jaw tighten. He had seen enough. Without a word, he pushed back his chair and stood. The saloon grew quieter, as men noticed his tall frame move toward the corner where Nayeli stood. He picked up a rag from the counter and handed it to her to wipe the spilled drink, his gesture calm but firm. Then he turned to the drunken cowboy and said evenly, "She's not the one who spilled it. That was you." The room went still. The drunken man looked from Ethan to Denton, unsure whether to laugh or fight. Denton's eyes narrowed, a flicker of annoyance crossing his smug face. No one usually dared to defend the Apache woman. Ethan's calm defiance was like a stone tossed into still water, sending ripples through the entire room. "You got something to say, stranger?" Denton drawled, his voice heavy with authority. Ethan looked him square in the eye. "Just calling things as they are. A man should own his mistakes." For a moment it seemed the saloon itself was holding its breath. Denton's men shifted uneasily, hands brushing their gun belts, but Denton only smirked. "Careful, cowboy. In this town, men who speak too freely often find themselves without a place to sleep." Ethan didn't flinch. "I've slept under the stars most of my life. A roof is a comfort, not a necessity." His words were steady, his voice low but sharp. He didn't shout, yet his calmness carried more weight than anger ever could. The tension broke when Denton laughed, though there was no humor in it. "You've got a mouth, Walker. Let's see if you've got the backbone to match." With that, he waved Nayeli forward, dismissing her like one might wave away dust. She lowered her head and obeyed, but not before her eyes met Ethan's for the briefest moment. There was no sound between them, yet in that fleeting glance a silent message passed. Gratitude, hope, and perhaps a spark of something more. After Denton left, whispers filled the saloon. Some men admired Ethan's courage, others shook their heads, certain he had just signed his own trouble. Ethan returned to his seat, sipping his drink quietly, but his thoughts were already turning. He had not planned to challenge Denton, but his heart could not allow silence when cruelty stood so boldly in front of him. The following days only deepened the unspoken bond. Whenever Nayeli was sent to town for supplies, Ethan found a way to be nearby. He carried her heavy baskets, offered her simple kindness, and treated her as he would any other person. Their conversations were brief, often no more than a few words, but in those words lived more meaning than hours of empty chatter. Nayeli, who had been silenced for so long, began to feel her voice return. She told Ethan once in a soft tone that her name meant "I love you" in her people's language. He repeated it back with care, as if her name were the most valuable word he had ever learned. For the first time in years, she felt like a person again, not a shadow. But Ethan knew kindness alone would not be enough. Denton's hold over her was strong, and breaking it would not be easy. He began asking quiet questions in town, learning more about the Baron's affairs. Some warned him to stop. Others told him tales of men who had crossed Denton and vanished. Still, Ethan pressed on. He had seen enough injustice in his life, and he could not ignore this one. One evening, Ethan walked the edge of Denton's ranch, watching from a distance as Nayeli moved through her endless chores. She carried wood to the shed, her figure small against the vast land. The sight filled Ethan with both sorrow and determination. He knew she deserved freedom, and he was beginning to realize he could not rest until she had it. Nayeli, meanwhile, found herself clinging to the memory of Ethan's words in the saloon. For years, she had believed no one would ever see her as more than a servant, but this cowboy, this quiet stranger, had looked at her with respect. That single act had planted a seed of hope deep within her heart. Late that night, as the wind whistled across the empty plains, Nayeli whispered to herself in her native tongue. She prayed not for riches, not for revenge, but for a chance at freedom. Somewhere beyond the ranch walls, Ethan Walker lay awake under the stars, thinking of her, planning silently what must come next. The path ahead would be dangerous. Denton was a man who would not give up control easily, and the town itself seemed bent under his shadow. Yet destiny had already set its course. A cowboy's sense of justice had collided with the quiet strength of a captive woman, and the Wild West was about to witness a storm. The night in Red Rock was quiet, but for Ethan Walker the silence carried the weight of decision. He lay beneath the open sky, the stars scattered like silver dust above him, and thought of the Apache woman whose life had been caged for too long. The fire beside him flickered low, casting shadows against his weathered face. Ethan had always been a drifter, a man with no ties strong enough to keep him in one place. But now he felt something anchor him more firmly than any ranch, any herd, or any pile of gold ever could. It was the thought of Nayeli, her tired eyes still carrying the spark of dignity that no cruelty could extinguish. He knew the risk. Denton was not a man who gave up power. If Ethan dared to take Nayeli away, the Baron would send his riders after them. Blood would be shed, and the law, already bent to Denton's will, would not protect them. Still, Ethan's heart had already chosen. Some battles a man avoided, some battles he endured, and some battles, no matter the danger, he had to fight. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Denton planned to host a gathering at his ranch, inviting wealthy neighbors to drink and boast over cattle numbers. He had ordered Nayeli to prepare the house, leaving her exhausted from the endless demands. Ethan, watching from the edges of the ranch, saw how her steps dragged heavier each day. That night, when she carried wood to the shed, Ethan moved through the shadows until he was close enough to speak without being overheard. "You don't belong here," he said softly. Nayeli froze, her heart leaping at the sound of his voice. For a moment, fear struck her, fear that she would be caught speaking to him. But when she turned and saw his steady gaze, the fear melted into something else, a strange mix of hope and disbelief. "I cannot leave," she whispered, glancing toward the main house. "They would come after me." "They might," Ethan admitted. "But if you stay, nothing will change. If you ride with me, I'll see you safe. I promise." Her hands trembled against the stack of wood. For years she had been taught that escape was impossible. Denton's men were everywhere, his cruelty unending. But in Ethan's voice there was no false bravado, no empty charm, only truth. She could see that he meant every word. Nayeli looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, the decision quiet but firm. "When?" "Tomorrow night," Ethan answered. "When the Baron is drunk and the men are loud, we'll slip away." The plan was simple, but the risk enormous. Ethan prepared through the day, making sure his horse was ready and his rifle loaded. He traded quietly in town for supplies, a small sack of dried meat, a canteen, and blankets. Every movement was done with care, for he knew one careless word could betray them both. When night fell, the ranch came alive with drunken laughter. Denton and his guests filled the rooms with noise, whiskey spilling like water. Nayeli moved through the chaos silently, carrying trays, refilling cups, ignored by all but the cruelest eyes. Yet inside her chest her heart pounded. She knew tonight would decide her fate. When the moon was high and the noise of the party was at its peak, she slipped quietly toward the barn. Ethan was waiting in the shadows, his horse saddled, another horse ready for her. He saw her approach, her figure small against the barn door, but her step steady. "Are you ready?" he asked. "Yes," she whispered. Her voice trembled, but her eyes were clear. Together they mounted their horses and rode into the night. For a brief moment freedom tasted sweet. The cool wind brushed against her face and the wide open land stretched before her. She had almost forgotten what it felt like to ride without chains of duty. But freedom is never given without a fight. The sound of hooves thundered behind them. Denton's men had noticed. Shouts pierced the night, followed by the sharp crack of gunfire. Bullets tore through the air, some striking the dirt near their horses' feet. Ethan urged his horse faster, keeping close to Nayeli as they raced across the open plain. "Hold on," he shouted, steering them toward the river that cut through the land. If they could cross, the riders might lose their trail. The chase was fierce. The river came into view, its waters swollen from recent rains, rushing dark and fast beneath the moonlight. Without hesitation, Ethan spurred his horse into the water, guiding Nayeli to follow. The current pulled hard, but they pushed through, water splashing against them as the horses fought to keep footing. Behind them, Denton's men cursed, their shots going wide. At last, the horses climbed the far bank, dripping and exhausted. Ethan turned, rifle in hand, ready to defend if the riders followed. But the current was too strong, and Denton's men did not risk it. Their shouts faded into the distance as Ethan and Nayeli disappeared into the night. Breathing hard, Nayeli clung to the reins, her heart racing. For the first time in years, she was beyond Denton's reach, yet fear still clung to her, fear that he would never stop searching. They rode until the first light of dawn painted the sky pale pink. Exhausted, they stopped in a canyon sheltered by tall cliffs. Ethan helped her down from the horse, spreading a blanket on the ground. She sat, her legs trembling, her hands still shaking. "You're safe for now," Ethan said, kneeling beside her. Nayeli looked at him, tears forming in her eyes. "I have not been free since I was a girl," she whispered. "I do not remember what it feels like to belong to myself." "You'll remember," Ethan promised. "And no man will take that from you again." For the first time, Nayeli let herself breathe deeply, filling her lungs with air that felt like her own. She looked at the rising sun, the cliffs glowing in its light, and for the first time in years she allowed herself to hope. As they rested, Ethan asked her about her people. Slowly at first, then with growing courage, Nayeli shared fragments of her past. She told him of her father, a proud hunter, her mother, a singer of old songs, and the life of her tribe before raids and loss scattered them. Her voice carried sadness but also pride. Ethan listened quietly, respecting each word as sacred. The journey ahead would not be easy. Denton would send more men. The town might turn against them. But as they sat together in that canyon, bound by danger and trust, something deeper began to grow. They were no longer just a drifter and a captive. They were allies in survival, partners in escape, and perhaps, without fully knowing it, two souls who had begun to see in each other a chance at belonging. The Wild West was vast, unforgiving, and often cruel. But within its deserts and canyons, freedom was possible for those who dared to take it. And that night, as Nayeli closed her eyes beneath the rising sun, she dreamed not of chains but of open skies. The morning sun rose slowly over the canyon where Ethan and Nayeli had taken shelter. The cool night air gave way to heat, and the land stretched out before them, wild, open, and free. For the first time in years, Nayeli was not carrying water for others or bending to cruel orders. She sat on a blanket beside a small fire Ethan had built, her dark hair catching the light as the smoke curled into the air. It felt strange, almost unreal, to be still without fear pressing against her back. Ethan studied her quietly while tending the fire. He had seen hardship before, but Nayeli's courage struck him in a way that no battle or trail had. She carried scars no eye could see, yet her spirit remained unbroken. He admired that strength, though he also knew the fight was not over. Denton would not simply forget the woman he had held for years. The Baron's pride alone would not allow it. After a simple breakfast of dried meat and bread, Ethan saddled the horses. "We can't stay here," he told her. "Denton's men will search. They'll expect us to ride far, so we'll go where they least expect." "Where will we go?" Nayeli asked softly. "My land," Ethan replied. "It's not much, just a small homestead past the river. But it's mine, and no one tells me how to live there." The word homestead sounded foreign to Nayeli. For so long she had known only labor under another man's command. Yet there was a steadiness in Ethan's voice, a promise that his land would be a place of safety, not chains. She nodded, trusting him. The journey to Ethan's homestead took 2 days. They rode across rolling plains where the wind whispered through tall grass, and over rocky ridges where the path narrowed to a single trail. At night, they camped under the stars, sharing quiet conversations. Ethan asked her about the songs her mother had taught her, and sometimes she sang softly, her voice carrying through the still night air. Each song was a piece of her people, a reminder that though her body had been captive, her spirit remained tied to her roots. By the time they reached the homestead, Nayeli felt both weary and alive in ways she had not thought possible. Ethan's land was small, but it was his own. A modest cabin stood near a line of cottonwood trees, with a corral nearby and a patch of soil where crops had once been planted. It was not rich land, but it was quiet, open, and free of Denton's shadow. "This is home," Ethan said simply, helping her down from the horse. Nayeli looked around, taking in the humble cabin. It was not grand like Denton's house, yet she felt a sense of peace here. For years she had lived in a place built on cruelty. This place, though worn and weathered, held no cruelty in its walls. The days that followed were unlike any she had known. Ethan showed her how to plant seeds in the soil, how to mend fences, how to fetch water from the nearby stream. She was not ordered, not forced. She chose to help, and in that choice lay a freedom sweeter than gold. Nayeli laughed one afternoon while trying to chase a stubborn chicken back into its pen, and Ethan realized he had never heard a sound more beautiful. But shadows lingered even in the sunlight. At night, Nayeli sometimes woke with fear, certain she heard riders in the distance. She remembered Denton's threats, his cruel voice telling her she would never escape. Ethan, noticing her unease, would sit by the fire with his rifle across his knees, his calm presence a silent promise that no harm would come to her again. Word spread quickly in Red Rock. The Baron raged when he discovered Nayeli gone. He sent riders to search the trails, questioning townsfolk, offering rewards for information. Some people pitied Nayeli's escape, others feared Denton's anger and stayed silent. The sheriff looked the other way, too deeply tied to the Baron's pocket to interfere. It was not long before the whispers reached Ethan's ears. A neighbor rode by one evening, a weathered farmer with kind eyes. "Denton's looking," he warned. "He won't let this rest, Walker. You'd best be ready." "I've been ready all my life," Ethan replied. Still, he knew the danger was real. Denton's wealth gave him power, but it was his pride that made him dangerous. A man like Denton could not bear to lose control. He would come sooner or later. Meanwhile, Ethan and Nayeli's bond deepened. They worked side by side, sharing laughter in small moments, sharing silence in others. Ethan respected her strength. never treating her as less than his equal. Naeli, in turn, saw in him not just a protector, but a man of honor. Slowly, she began to believe that her life could be more than survival. It could be lived. One evening, while they sat watching the sunset over the plains, Naeli spoke of her fears. "He will come for me," she whispered. "Men like him do not forget." Ethan turned to her, his expression steady. "Then let him come. He'll find I don't scare easy." His words comforted her, though deep inside she still feared the Baron's reach. Yet there was another truth growing in her heart, her feelings for Ethan. She had never known a man who treated her with such care. He asked nothing of her but honesty, gave without demand and protected without chains. It was a new kind of strength, one that made her heart beat faster when he was near. Life at the homestead was not easy, but it was real. They mended fences, planted crops, hauled water, and faced the stubbornness of weather and land. Each small victory, each meal they shared felt like a piece of freedom stitched into their days. Naeli found herself humming her mother's songs while grinding corn, her voice no longer silenced by fear. Yet the threat remained. One afternoon, while Ethan was working the corral, a rider approached from the horizon. Dust rose behind him as he drew closer. Ethan's hand rested on his rifle as he watched, but when the rider dismounted, Ethan recognized him. It was the farmer neighbor again, his face grave. "Denton's filed a claim with the sheriff," the man said. "He says Naeli belongs to him. He means to drag her back, legal or not." Ethan's jaw tightened. "She belongs to no one." The neighbor nodded. "I believe that. But Denton won't let this go. You need to be ready, Walker. The whole town will hear of it soon." That night, Ethan told Naeli the news. She listened in silence, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes dark with worry. "I cannot go back," she whispered. "I would rather die than live that life again." Ethan knelt before her, taking her hands gently. "You won't go back. Not while I still breathe." The firelight flickered across their faces, casting long shadows on the cabin walls. In that moment, Naeli felt the depth of his promise. He was not a man of empty words. He would fight for her, even against the wealth and power of Denton. And she, who had once believed herself voiceless, began to find courage in his steadiness. The days that followed were tense. Ethan prepared quietly, making sure his rifle was cleaned, his horses ready. He trained Naeli to ride faster. To shoot a small pistol he gave her for protection. Though her hands shook at first, she grew steadier each day. She was no longer only the woman Denton had tried to break. She was becoming someone stronger, someone free. And as the horizon glowed with storms in the distance, Ethan knew the real storm was coming. Denton's pride had been wounded, and men like him never rested until their power was restored. The showdown was inevitable, but Ethan Walker had already made his choice. He had lived too long drifting through a world filled with cruelty. Now he had something worth standing for. He had someone worth protecting. And in the quiet of that homestead, beneath the cottonwood trees, Naeli felt something she had never thought she would feel again. Hope. The morning broke clear and bright, but Ethan Walker sensed a shadow in the wind. He stood on the porch of his small homestead, eyes fixed on the horizon where the land stretched wide and endless. Birds sang in the cottonwood trees, and the air carried the smell of fresh earth from the small patch of crops they had planted. To any passerby, it was a peaceful morning. But Ethan knew better. Peace never lasted when men like Charles Denton were stirred. Inside the cabin, Naeli moved quietly, her dark hair braided neatly as she prepared bread. She had grown stronger in the days since her escape, her steps lighter, her voice no longer silenced by fear, yet she too felt the heaviness in the air. Each day she waited for the sound of hooves, the harsh laughter of Denton's men coming to drag her back. Each night she dreamed of chains breaking, only to wake with her heart pounding. Ethan stepped inside, setting his hat on the table. "It won't be long now," he said. Naeli looked at him, her hands stilling on the dough. "You think he will come today?" "Maybe not today, maybe tomorrow. But he will come. A man like Denton doesn't forget, and he doesn't forgive." Naeli lowered her gaze, fear flickering in her eyes. "What if he takes me back?" Ethan crossed the room, placing his hand gently on hers. His voice was steady, calm as the earth itself. "That won't happen. Not while I stand." She searched his face, and though worry lingered, she saw truth in his eyes. He was not a man who spoke without meaning. His promise was a wall, solid and unshaken. For the first time, she let herself believe that she would never again live under Denton's shadow. The tension finally broke 3 days later. The sound of riders thundered across the plain, a cloud of dust rising behind them. Ethan was fixing the corral fence when he heard it, his body tensing instantly. Nayeli stepped out of the cabin, her heart racing as she saw the approaching men. At their head rode Denton himself, his fine coat dusted from the trail, his face twisted with rage. Behind him were 6 riders, all armed. They stopped a few yards from the cabin, horses stamping the dirt. Denton's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Walker, you've got something of mine. Bring her out or I'll take her with fire and lead." Ethan walked forward slowly, his rifle resting easy in his hands. He stopped at the fence, his tall frame calm and steady against the morning light. "She's not yours, Denton. She never was. She's free and she stays here." Laughter erupted among Denton's men, but it was hollow. Denton's eyes narrowed, his pride burning hotter than the sun overhead. "You think you can stand against me? I own this land, this town, even the sheriff. You're just a drifter with nothing." Ethan's jaw tightened, but his voice remained even. "I've drifted long enough. Now I've got something worth fighting for, and no man owns another's life, not here, not anywhere." Nayeli stood just behind the doorway of the cabin, watching, her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to run, to hide, but something inside her told her not to. She would not live in shadows anymore. She stepped forward, moving to stand beside Ethan. Her presence made Denton sneer. "Look at you," Denton spat.
"Thinking you can choose."
"You're nothing without me. You are mine, and you always will be." Nayeli lifted her chin, her voice steady, though her heart pounded. "I was never yours. You tried to break me, but you never did. I am free now. I belong only to myself." Her words carried across the land like an arrow. For years she had been forced into silence, but now her voice was sharp, unshaken. Denton's face twisted with fury. "Enough," he growled. "Men, take her." The riders spurred forward, but Ethan was faster. He raised his rifle, firing a warning shot into the dirt before their horses. The animals reared, throwing the line of riders into chaos. "The first man who crosses this fence," Ethan warned, his voice like steel, "won't take another step." The riders hesitated. Denton's fury burned, but even his men wavered at the sight of Ethan's steady aim. They knew his type. A drifter with nothing to lose was the most dangerous man of all. "Cowards," Denton barked at his men. Then he turned his glare back to Ethan. "You think this is over? You think you can defy me and walk away?" Ethan's eyes never left his. "It ends here. You can ride away and live, or you can draw and fall. Your choice." For a long moment, silence hung heavy in the air. The wind rustled the cottonwood leaves, the horses shifted nervously, and the land seemed to hold its breath. Denton's hand twitched near his gun. Pride warred with caution, rage with survival. At last his fury broke. With a curse, Denton yanked the reins of his horse. "This ain't finished, Walker," he snarled. "You'll regret this day." With that, he turned his horse sharply, galloping back toward the horizon. His men followed, some glancing nervously over their shoulders at the steady cowboy and the brave woman standing beside him. The dust settled slowly. Ethan lowered his rifle, his muscles finally easing. Nayeli let out a long breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with relief and something deeper. "You stood for me," she whispered. "I stood for what's right," Ethan replied. Then his voice softened. "But I'd stand for you 1,000 times over." Tears filled her eyes, but they were not of sorrow. They were of freedom, of gratitude, of the knowledge that she was no longer alone. She stepped closer, her hand brushing his. For years she had been treated as less than human, but in Ethan's presence she felt wholly herself, respected, valued, and cherished. Life after that day was not without challenges. Denton's power in town weakened, but his bitterness remained. Yet as time passed, his grip loosened. The townsfolk, seeing Ethan's quiet courage and Nayeli's resilience, began to respect them. Whispers of the Apache woman who had defied the Baron spread, not as mockery but as admiration. Seasons turned. The crops grew tall, the cabin became more than wood and nails, it became a home. Ethan and Nayeli worked side by side, their laughter and songs filling the air. Slowly neighbors began to visit, bringing seeds to plant, tools to share. Where once there had been suspicion, now there was acceptance. In time, Ethan and Nayeli stood together beneath the cottonwoods, hand in hand as neighbors gathered. It was a simple ceremony, no grand speeches, only quiet vows spoken from the heart. He promised to protect and honor her, and she promised to walk beside him in freedom. When the words were done, the crowd cheered and Nayeli smiled brighter than the sun. The years ahead were still hard. The West was a land of struggle where storms, drought, and hardship never ended. But they faced it together. Nayeli found joy in planting her garden, in singing the songs of her people while grinding corn. Ethan found peace in a life no longer restless, in the steady rhythm of ranch work and the warmth of love beside him. Sometimes at night, Nayeli would stand beneath the stars and whisper to her ancestors. She would thank them for the strength that carried her through dark years, for the courage that led her to freedom. Beside her, Ethan would wrap an arm around her shoulders, his presence as steady as the land. And so her story, once one of captivity, became a story of freedom, love, and legacy. She was no longer a shadow in the Baron's house. She was Nayeli, wife, partner, and free woman, standing proud on the land that was now truly hers.